In this step, we'll look at another important feature of a production-ready application, monitoring. You'd want to be able to look at what's happening in the background with your application. The Spring Boot feature which enables you to do that is Spring Boot Actuator. It helps you to monitor and manage your application in production. Spring Boot Actuator provides you with a number of endpoints. You'd be able to look at all the Spring beans which are part of your application using this beans endpoint. You have health endpoint where you can look at the application health information. Is your application up and running? That's health. You can also get a number of metrics related to your application going to the metrics endpoint. And you also can get details around all the request mappings that are configured in your application when you go to the mappings endpoint. There are a lot of other endpoints which are exposed by Spring Boot Actuator. What I'm showing in here is a selection of them. Now, how do you make use of Spring Boot Actuator? As usual, it's very, very easy. So let's go over to our pom.xml. And I'll copy the starter web. And I'll say Spring Boot Starter Actuator. And save this out. I don't have any application running right now, so that's cool. So I can go ahead and launch the application up from here. So learn Spring Boot application. Let's launch that app. The application is now up and running. And let's go over to the browser and type in the URL localhost 8080 Actuator. You'd see this JSON response come back. It has a link to the self, to the current URL, and it has a link to the health URL. So if you click the health URL, localhost 8080 Actuator health, you'd see the status of the application. The status of the application is currently up and running. By default, whenever you launch up Actuator, it will only expose the health endpoint. If you want more features from Actuator, you need to enable them in application.properties. You can go to the application.properties and type in management. We want to configure additional endpoints. So web.exposure.include is equal to star. So this would expose all the endpoints which are provided by Actuator. So you can see that the application has started up, and I would go in and refresh the Actuator URL. So localhost 8080 Actuator, I've refreshed it. And now you should see a number of endpoints which are shown in here. You don't really need to understand every endpoint which is present in here. Let's quickly take a look at some of the important ones. So if you look at Spring Boot Actuator beans, this should show all the Spring beans which are loaded. Earlier, we created course resource. Earlier, we created a course controller. You'd see that there is a bean for course controller. There would be a bean for dispatcher servlet. There would be a bean for error MVC configuration. So for all the things which are auto-configured, you should see a bean which is present in here. So if you want to find out if a specific thing is auto-configured or not, this is another way you can do that. You can go to Actuator beans and see if a specific Spring bean is configured for you. So that's localhost 8080 Actuator beans. Let's close that. In addition, we already looked at the health. Health is exposed by default. That's always present. The next endpoint we'll look at is config props. Localhost 8080 Actuator config props. If you open that app, you should see all the things that you can configure from application.properties for our application. You would also see the specific thing that we have created. We have created currency service configuration. So you can configure values for currency service. The way you can configure it by currency service.url, currency service.key, currency service.username. You can also see the current values which are picked up in here. You can see that the value dev.in28minutes.com is being picked up from application-dev.properties. Similar to that, you can see other things in here as well. If you go to actuator/env, this is the environment endpoint. The environment endpoint shows you all the details about the environment. We are making use of port 8080. We are making use of Java 17. You see the specific encoding which is making. You can see the encoding which is being made use of. You can see the class path which is configured for our application. And you can see a lot more details about the environment where we are running in here. So you'll see information about Java, JVM, Tomcat, everything would be present in here. Now, the last one which we'll explore is something called metrics. If you scroll down, you should see this localhost 8080 actuator metrics. If you open it up, you should see a list of metrics which come back. You can see application started time, disk free space, total space. You can see details about you can see metrics around the executor pool. You can see a number of metrics related to JVM in here as well. What I'll do is I'll look at a specific metric, HTTP server dot requests. So I'll copy this, put a slash, and type in HTTP server requests. You can see all the metrics around HTTP server requests in here. You can see that right now, the count of requests is 8. The total time of execution to handle those requests is this much. And the max to handle a specific request is 0.020 seconds. Now let's go to Actuator, fire this URL a few times. I'm refreshing this page about 10 times. And let's go back to Actuator metrics and refresh that specific HTTP server request metric. You can see that the count of requests has increased. So it's tracking the number of requests which are coming in to your application. So Actuator provides you with a lot of information about your application and the environment in which your application is running. You can get a lot of metrics about your application, and you will be able to also get a lot of metrics around the Java runtime or the JVM and the Tomcat server where your application is running in. One of the important things to remember about Actuator is that whenever you enable a lot of endpoints, you are gathering that information. And gathering a lot of information means more CPU and more memory. Typically, you need to explicitly configure the endpoints you would want to include. So for example, I can configure health, metrics. These are the only ones which I'm making use of, for example. So I'll enable them. And if you go back to the Actuator, you should see that there are only these endpoints which are exposed right now, health and metrics. In this step, we looked at monitoring your application in production. The feature in Spring Boot that you can make use of is Spring Boot Actuator.